Hello everybody, how are you doing today? I hope you're doing well and I hope your reading is going well. Today we're going to be talking about a novel that is very near and dear to my heart. It is George Eliot's Middlemarch. I'm going to be giving you 10 top tips for cracking into the cosmos of Middlemarch because, unfairly in my opinion, Middlemarch has the reputation of being rather difficult, and the prospective reader coming to Middlemarch for the first time feels it to be a rather daunting enterprise. And this is a shame because it's actually an incredibly enjoyable and rewarding and nourishing experience, and it doesn't take too many reading tools to crack into Middlemarch and get a lot out of it. So let's talk about how to get as much out of this book as possible. It most certainly is worth reading because in addition to the unfair reputation of being incredibly difficult, which it is not, though it is demanding, there's a difference, it has the very fair and very apt reputation of being the greatest English novel and one of the greatest novels written in English. So let's get into the tips. Okay, let's dispense with an obvious but very useful and pertinent tip right off the bat, and that is to make sure you have a good edition of this work. My style of reading, the reading style that I'm going to recommend to you shortly, many of you already know it, is going to require a copy that you're very comfortable with, because you're going to be travelling with this copy, you're going to be spending time with it over the long term. So you want to be comfortable with it, and it has to suit your sensibility, your temperament as a reader. There are many different wonderful editions of this novel. We are spoilt for choice. If George Eliot was here today, she would be astounded. But my top 3 recommendations are as follows. My number 1 recommendation would be the Penguin paperback. The Penguin Classics paperback, okay? So this actually isn't too unwieldy as a paperback. It's true, in the original publication, which we'll talk more of in a moment, the novel was published in 8 instalments of around 100 or so pages apiece. And we used to split our novels up into multiple volumes. In the Victorian era, we had the triple-decker, that's the 3-volume set, which readers would check out from Moody's lending and subscription library. Or indeed, readers would read serially as it came out in their favourite literary periodical or newspaper of choice. Now, somewhere along the evolution of publishing, we moved away from the multi-volume sets and we started putting these really big novels into one volume, which is a shame. I love having multiple volumes, especially for big works. Now, even today, it doesn't quite make sense for some novels. In Search of Lost Time by Marcel Proust, War and Peace by Leo Tolstoy, Clarissa by Samuel Richardson. Many readers will opt for multi-volumes. Indeed, there are single volumes of all of these works, but they are unwieldy. They are wrist breakers. But all this to say, the Penguin paperback, the Penguin Classics version, is not so unwieldy. It's actually very compact, and it's perfect for marginalia, which I heartily recommend for the prospective reader of Middlemarch, because George Eliot uses the novel as her essay form and she thinks through everything. And the best way to read her novel in a way that honours her thought process is to think through everything alongside her. And what's the best way to think things through? It is to write your thoughts down. We do not know what we think about something until we write it. So let us write in the margins and enter a dialogue with our authors. It's the best way to really honour what they've done. So my top recommendation, and this is the edition I will be using for the book club lecture series, I'll be referring to the page numbers throughout, is the Penguin Classics paperback. Indeed, if you want a multi-volume set, I heartily recommend you try to hunt out, and this may be difficult and you'll need to go second-hand, but try to hunt out one of the old Everyman 2-volume editions. I love how slim these are, how compact they are. You can put them in your pocket. They're beautiful. The images on the cover are absolutely beautiful. That's a good choice too if you're in the market for a hardback, and indeed Everyman, their modern edition, is in 1 volume and is hardback. That's good too. Another great paperback, by the way, is the Oxford World's Classics. Again, a little bit of hunting might be required. It seems to be relatively out of print, at least when I last checked, but the annotations are really, really good in this one, and the introductions are always good with Oxford World's Classics. Now, I actually treated myself to another edition, yet another edition of Middlemarch just the other day. I got this at a bargain price at a second-hand bookstore. This is the folio hardback edition of Middlemarch. And I picked this up because the illustrations are absolutely delightful. And I actually thought, looking at the margin space in this copy, that there was a lot of room to play with. So I'm kind of tempted, beautiful though this edition is, to scribble in the margins of this one and really make it my own. Now let's get into a reading specific tip. As you make your way through Middlemarch, be on the lookout or pay special attention to the epigraphs that preface each and every chapter. Eliot put a lot of love and care and deep research into every aspect of her novel writing, to the point where her research filled up volumes and volumes of its own. For Middlemarch, we have the quarry, and we can see her noting down medical research. We can see her noting down all the relevant issues in the age of reform, the age of science. We can see her going into incredible detail with her characters, and yes, the characters are incredibly psychologically complex. We'll get to that in a second. She also put a lot of love and care into choosing the quotation that would preface each and every chapter. Now, why should we pay special attention to these quotations? Well, they are the key to unlocking each and every chapter. And each and every chapter has something of its own thesis, its own statement about one facet of the human condition. So they're worth paying attention to. So what we should do is read that quotation, prefacing the chapter, immerse ourselves in the chapter, and when we get to the end of that chapter, rather than going on, go back to the beginning of the chapter and pay special, close care and attention to that epigraph, because it will contextualize and elevate everything you've just read. Bonus points for those who want to go down the rabbit hole and explore further. Eliot deploys epigraphs from Shakespeare, Cervantes, Burton, and many more, and indeed she even crafts some of her own. Chapter 1 deploys a quotation from The Maid's Tragedy by Beaumont and Fletcher. Chapter 2 has a wonderful extract from Cervantes' masterpiece Don Quixote concerning the helmet of Mambrino. We went into a lot of depth regarding the helmet of Mambrino in the Hardcore Literature Book Club in the Don Quixote lecture series. So those who have been exposed to those lectures or those who have read through those passages of Don Quixote will immediately know what Eliot is trying to say in that chapter. Chapter 3 has a quotation from Paradise Lost by John Milton, highly relevant. And an extra bonus tip is to pay attention to the names peppered throughout the novel. So you will see Milton mentioned, you will see Locke mentioned, you'll see Pascal mentioned. Go on hunts and try to figure out who these thinkers and writers were, what their main works were, what their main arguments were, and try to pick up extra material to read around your journey into Middlemarch. And that leads on to our next tip, because this most certainly is a journey. This is an immersive reading experience. To read Middlemarch well is to fully immerse yourself and take your time, but also to persevere. Now, I think any reader who gets through the first few chapters and gets to grips with everything, meets the characters, gets immersed in the world, learns what concerns the different characters and so on, and really brings their whole self to the work, perseverance won't be necessary. You'll want to keep reading. But hey, it is a little bit difficult to start with, especially with that preface. The preface, by the way, requires special care and attention. Go somewhere quiet with a pen and a pad of paper and give inordinate amounts of time to that preface. Break every single sentence apart, because that preface is also a key to understanding and unlocking the book too. But my tip is very much to persevere with the work. This is a work that requires patience. Regardless of how deeply and madly you fall in love with Middlemarch, patience is required, because even to the reader that falls in love with Middlemarch, the novel does not yield all of its gifts at once. It does not yield everything on the first reading, and it does not yield even a fraction of what it has to offer you on a very, very quick and superficial reading. So take your time, delight in the experience, and really meet those characters. Like Tolstoy, George Eliot crafts psychologically complex characters, and she houses them in a work of incredible cognitive power. You meet these characters and you realise that they are not types, they're not stereotypes, they're not stock characters, they're not Theophraston archetypes, they are people. And like people, they are not wholly good or wholly bad. But everybody has a mixture of good and bad, and the primary fault in Eliot's characters is egotism. Just like the real world, just like the real world. So my next tip is to reinforce something I said just a moment ago, which is that Eliot uses her novel as her essay form. And remember the etymological root of essay, which means to attempt. She is attempting to unravel many different political, sociological, economic, moral and aesthetic issues over the course of her novel, and you should try to unravel them alongside her. There are few authors, in fact one would be very hard pushed to come up with another author, apart from perhaps Shakespeare and Emily Dickinson, who thought through their ideas with such originality and with such invention and with such power as George Eliot. She is an extraordinary novelist. So think through everything with her, treat it not only as an immersive experience, vicarious living, treat it not only as a bit of escapism, which I think we should start elevating because escapism has strong utility for forging character and for changing how we interact in the world, how we think about different things. But treat the work as though it is an essay and it has things to teach you. It most certainly does. Eliot put a lot of her heart and her life, her lived experience into this work. This one was brewing for decades. Although it very much did seem to stop and start at the beginning, and Middlemarch was originally two different narratives, she brought them together. And as she experienced deep grief for a loved one over the writing period, she did abandon the work and need to come back to it. But what I'm trying to say is it wasn't forged in a weekend. The idea didn't simply crop up to her. Like all these great authors, I believe that whatever they profess is simply what is at the forefront. We're talking about manifest versus latent, okay? So a lot of these creations, and if we are to say that Miss Brooke, for example, has a lot of Eliot in her, a lot of these creations are being formed unconsciously for many years, many decades without the author even knowing. So leading on from that tip, I would also like to offer you the hint or the nudge towards contextualizing Middlemarch. One must read Middlemarch in light of the age of reform. Middlemarch was published in 1871 through to 1872 in serial fashion. But the events of the novel take place on the cusp of a domino effect, a cascade of reform dominoes. Reform happened in every facet of life in England, and it most certainly needed to happen. There was widespread inequality across England, coupled with industrialisation and sudden upward mobility, or at least some wiggle room in the middle classes, a huge population surge, and mass migration from agricultural backgrounds, rural backgrounds, into the city, and intense urbanisation with those who were once agricultural workers suddenly filling up the factories. Pair all of this with a national anxiety, tinged by the events that English citizens and lawmakers saw taking place across the Channel. Indeed, the events that many had lived through towards the end of the previous century. There was this anxiety in England that revolution, bloodthirsty revolution, that virtue, striding hand in hand with terror, would take over England too. The big question in the background of everybody's mind was, could change happen without violence? And though there were pockets of uprising and there was a lot of dissatisfaction, there was a lot of anger, England showed that yes, change could happen without violence. We could have reform without violence. And Middlemarch is set right on the cusp of some very key reforms. Between the time in which Middlemarch was set, the early 1830s, and the time in which Eliot was publishing, readers would have lived through a lot. Reform across the board. Educational reform, industrial reform, marriage reform. And indeed, as you read through Middlemarch, it might be pertinent to keep in mind that though Eliot had rather unconventional living arrangements for the time. She was in an open marriage ostensibly because her husband, for want of a better word, George Henry Lewes, who was also acting as her publisher, was still married. This was the primary reason why she used a pseudonym, a male pseudonym. This is actually a time in which male writers were inclined to use female pseudonyms because most of the bestsellers, aside from writers like Charles Dickens and Victor Hugo, were indeed women. The reason she used George Eliot, in addition to liking how it felt in the mouth to say it, George Eliot, was to conceal her unconventional living arrangements. The founder of the lending library, Charles Moody, even seemed on the verge of snubbing her publications due to this very fact, so it's completely understandable. Keep in mind that despite George Eliot being thoroughly liberal for her time, and I like what Terry Eagleton says in the English novel, he says you can tell George Eliot is a liberal by how she writes, the sentence structure, how she lays everything out, her word choice, you can tell her political affiliation. Despite that, she's actually not for many of the reforms. Many contemporary writers have pointed out that she is pretty much only for one of the 6 major reforms. But I will leave that for you to hunt out and explore more. This is quite a rabbit hole to go down. And this will form the backbone of the very first Middlemarch lecture in the Hardcore Literature Book Club. We'll go into a lot of depth on this one. It's very interesting. And this is work that is going to reward you over and over again, especially when you read any novel, either set in that era or coming out of that era. It's also interesting to note that Eliot was the first generation of writers who were looking back to the not so distant, the nascent past. And this was a preoccupation that would tinge those writers she would go on to influence. Thomas Hardy, for example, is a thoroughly Eliotic writer. He's also Shelleyan and Keatsian, but he's thoroughly Eliotic. My next tip for you is a very important one, and it is to read Middlemarch serially. As I've mentioned, Middlemarch was originally published in 8 installments in serial fashion. The very first installment, Miss Brooke, was published on the 1st of December 1871. And the next installment would come out at the beginning of February 1872. They were published in very attractive jackets. Indeed, we can see George Henry Lewes acting as Eliot's agent in discussion with John Blackwood, the publisher responsible for bringing Eliot to the forefront. He saw her potential when she didn't even affix her name to her manuscripts. They designed the covers to look thoroughly un-bookstallish, and though the single installments were remarkably expensive, indeed it would cost many people a week's worth of wages at least just to get their hands on them, they were trying to undercut the public lending library, and they were trying to create a culture of purchasers of novels rather than borrowers. Middlemarch is so incredibly dense and layered that reading serially is most certainly the way to go to get as much out of it as possible. It's also the way that Eliot designed the book to be read. We did a thought experiment in the book club where we showed what the year of 1871 was like. What would it have looked like as you were walking through the cold streets, and December at that time was incredibly cold and would give way to the wettest year on record. What would it look like as you were bracing the bitter cold of early December and you chance upon that gorgeous first edition? And of course you would take it home, and because of the expense it would have to be a gift, but it would also be a communal experience. You would read it aloud to your family, perhaps. We explored what it might look like, what other books were on the book stands at the time. And of course, you would have to wait a couple of months to get your hands on the next installment. So if you're reading serially, you are pacing it out. Read that first volume, Miss Brooke, and then do not go on to the very second issue until, say, February, if you're following along exactly. But if you're reading out of time, then give yourself 2 months before you go to that next installment. Now this means that you only need to read a couple of pages a day, if that. It also means that you should be reading other books alongside it. Now, if this is a new practice to you and you've never read serially before, or you've never read multiple novels, then this can cause a little bit of anxiety. But keep in mind that this is very achievable and this is preferable. This is how Eliot wants you to read Middlemarch. And you will bring your lived experience to those installments. You'll have a deeper immersion in the world because you'll be reading it over a longer time span. So everything that happens to your life, you can bring to the book. And you can bring the book to everything that happens to your life. And everything you read around it can help explicate and inform Middlemarch. It's a really good thought exercise to ponder about that first reader, to think what you may have looked like 5 or 6 generations back. You may even like to go on a little bit of a genealogical hunt and figure out what were your family conditions at the time in 1871 to really conceptualize. Indeed, it may have the effect of grounding one and making one eminently grateful, because many will find out that they most certainly wouldn't have the means to get their hands on Middlemarch. Yes, literacy rates were high at the time, historically speaking, but many still couldn't afford to purchase single issues as expensive as Middlemarch. They would have to go to the lending library with their annual subscription and check their books out. My next tip for you is to read Eliot up against complementary writers. Now, whether you deem a complementary writer to be one who was also writing at the time, say Dickens, who was incredibly popular, but Eliot was a superstar writer too, and she managed to do it with a much smaller back catalogue and with a much greater demand on the reader. She wanted her readers to think incredibly deeply, and she modelled her writing, her business practice on what Dickens was doing. He's a great one to illuminate Eliot all the more because he's not doing the same thing. Though he is capable of realism and psychologically complex characters, first and foremost, I see him as a romantic. Indeed, I see him as a blend of many things. I see him as foreshadowing the modernist movement, but he's also capable at dashing off the Gothic, he's capable of crime, the crime genre, he's capable of high society fiction, and much more. But he's doing something very, very different from Eliot, so it would be interesting to put those two up against each other. So if you have the time, as you're doing a slow, serialized reading of Middlemarch following the original publication schedule, then perhaps one of the books you choose to read alongside her is one from Dickens's oeuvre. Indeed, you may wish to chart the extent of George Eliot's influence. Perhaps pick up a Thomas Hardy novel. My first recommendation for that would be Tess of d'Urbervilles. We've just had a podcast come out on Tess. It's a long one because it's one of my favourite books and there's a lot to speak about. That would be a good one to see the effect that George Eliot had on other writers. My next recommendation is to get yourself a copy of Lyrical Ballads, the collaboration between William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. George Eliot is thoroughly Wordsworthian. He's a key influence upon her, and you can see this in her prose style. Specifically, read William Wordsworth's preface to the second edition of Lyrical Ballads, first published in 1801 in January, but referred to as the 1800 edition, and read specifically, focus on his romantic manifesto. He outlines 4 main things to keep in mind, and this can be a key to unlocking George Eliot, or at least a facet of her too. We'll pull apart the entire preface to Lyrical Ballads in the Hardcore Literature lecture series, but for now, the 4 main points to focus on are the ideas that, firstly, ordinary life is the best subject for poetry. Wordsworth, like Eliot, uses the layman's language. Second, everyday language is best suited for poetry. Third, expression of feeling is more important than plot or action. And 4, the very famous quote, poetry is the spontaneous overflow of emotion. So pulling this apart is key to reading Eliot as a romantic. My next tip is to make sure you are reading to enlarge your sympathies. George Eliot, in a letter, wrote that if art does not enlarge men's sympathies, it does nothing morally. Again, examine the root, the etymological root of this idea of sympathy, and we see that it goes hand in hand with suffering. If you are in simpatico with another, that means that their suffering becomes your suffering. So you must take on the concerns of the characters as though they were your own. Bare your soul, and as you are willingly suspending your disbelief, using a Coleridgean phrase now, engage on as deep an emotional level with their plight as possible. Because if you do not do this, then art does nothing morally, according to George Eliot. Doing this really emphasizes just how much of a collaborative activity reading is. You are in collaboration with George Eliot. She has done only so much, and now the rest is up to you. The rest is up to the reader. We must help her people this world, and we must bring our whole selves to them. Another tip for you is to make sure you have a nice journal, okay? Now, if you don't like marginalia or you're hesitant to mark your books, which I fully understand, then at least get yourself a journal, a Middlemarch journal. As we've said, she thinks through everything herself and she displays great cognitive power. Though Middlemarch is incredibly emotional, it is also incredibly cerebral, and you should find yourself thinking quite in depth about the different issues that George Eliot explores throughout the novel. So, as I said before, the best way to think is to think on paper. We don't know what we think until we write about it or speak about it. And very often, if we give ourselves liberty to write at length, quieting that inner editor, that inner censor for just a moment, if we write stream of consciousness, we may pen something and think, I don't agree with that. That's not quite right. So we go back to the underlying assumption. We solicit the help of George Eliot and other writers, and we try to figure out what we truly think about these grand themes of the human condition. And finally, I would like to give you a bonus tip, and that is to make sure you discuss the book with others. I know no better way to extract as much nourishment and insight from a great work than to discuss it with other people. Firstly, what you're doing is you're attempting to crystallize your own thoughts, or you're playing at what you may think, what you may believe. You're trying to discern your reaction to this piece of art, and therefore sharpening your abilities of aesthetic appreciation. But other people, by virtue of the fact that they have a different upbringing, they see the world through different paradigms, they're different people, will read the book in a different way and therefore have different insights to offer you. And we can put them together. We can bounce off of each other. We can bring different aspects into the light for one another, and we can truly be stronger together. I've long abandoned the idea that reading is a solitary activity. Yes, it can be, but even in our most solitary, reading is deeply communal, because not only are we communicating, often from beyond the grave and across language barriers and across cultural barriers, we're communicating with the author. Not only is that a fact, but we're communicating with ourselves. Deep work and reading the great books is self-talk, self-communication, self-knowledge. We're sharpening our empathy and our emotional prowess. We're improving our intrapersonal communication. That's our communication with ourselves. And that is what improves our communication with others. We know others by knowing ourselves. We talk to others better by talking to ourselves. And very often, talking, and truly talking, actually means listening. Listening to ourselves, listening to the author, and then listening to others. And so one of the greatest joys about undertaking a deep reading program is to have compadres, to have friends reading along with you. Now indeed, if you have people in your real life who want to do this with you, then great. That's a really rare thing, so cherish those people. If you have a loved one, a partner, a friend, a family member who wants to do it with you, wonderful. Do not let them go, and talk to them as deeply as possible. But it's a fact of the world that most people do not have those around them who want to talk deeply about the great ideas and the great books, and that's fine. But one of the wonders of the age of the internet is that we can find those like-minded lovers of literature and communicate with them. We already have a tribe, a community, who are lovingly and tenderly crafting their insights and their responses to these great books. And that's what we're doing joyfully in the endless discussion at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. And so I want to say good luck for preparing to breach Middlemarch. Our first book club lecture is right around the corner, so make sure you're leafing through that first book, Miss Brooke, and enjoying it. And also making sure, if you're reading serially, which I heartily recommend, that you go no further when you get to the end of Miss Brooke. But now, for the time being, please tell me your experience with this novel. If you've only just started reading it for the first time, then please tell me your initial impression. Even if you've only read a few pages, a couple of chapters, say, then please do let us know what you think of this novel. And indeed, if this is a reread, or if this is a novel that you've studied in the past, or if this is a novel that you've wanted to read for so long, then let us know your experience too. Thank you so much for watching today, and happy reading, everybody. Bye-bye for now.